when the temperature plummeted to 40 below zero in the remote Caribou Mountains. 2 cabins faced the same deadly blizzard. One group of wealthy survivalists burned through a winter's worth of firewood in just 3 days. Next door, an old man stayed comfortably warm using only mud, clay, and twigs. The Caribou Mountains of British Columbia do not care about your bank account, your expensive gear, or your social media following. When winter arrives, it comes with a brutal, indiscriminate force, burying the landscape under feet of snow and locking the world in deep freeze temperatures that can shatter iron. Arthur Gallagher knew this better than anyone. At 68 years old, the retired mechanic had spent the last 2 decades living on a modest, off-grid plot at the edge of a deep, alpine valley. Arthur was a quiet man, weathered like the cedar trees surrounding his property. He didn't have much money, nor did he have a garage full of snowmobiles and heavy machinery. What Arthur had was time, patience, and a deep respect for the unforgiving laws of thermodynamics. As late September rolled in, turning the birch leaves a brilliant, dying yellow, the mountain air already carried the sharp bite of impending winter. Arthur was busy preparing, but anyone watching him would have thought he was losing his mind. Instead of running a chainsaw from dawn until dusk, Arthur was down by the creek bed, knee-deep in freezing mud. He was hauling buckets of wet clay, coarse river sand, and dry straw back to his small, single-story cabin. He wasn't entirely alone on the mountain anymore. The previous spring, the sprawling 50-acre plot next to Arthur's had been purchased by David Carmichael. David was a 32-year-old former tech executive from Seattle who had decided to embrace the rugged, off-grid lifestyle. David hadn't come alone. He had brought 2 friends, Clara Hayes and Tom Becker, both equally eager to escape city life and document their wilderness survival journey. David's approach to wilderness living was one of overwhelming financial force. He had hired a team of contractors to speed build a massive A-frame log cabin with stunning vaulted ceilings and floor-to-ceiling double-pane windows. He imported a beautiful, incredibly expensive cast-iron fireplace from Norway that sat proudly in the center of their massive living room. One brisk afternoon in early October, David wandered over to Arthur's property. He was dressed in top-of-the-line Arc'teryx shell jackets and brand-new hiking boots that hadn't seen a drop of mud. He found Arthur standing barefoot on a heavy canvas tarp, stomping a mixture of clay, sand, and straw into a thick, moldable dough known as cob. Making mud pies. "Arthur?" David asked, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips. Arthur paused, wiping a streak of grey clay from his forehead. "Building a stove," he replied simply, gesturing toward his cabin door. David chuckled, shaking his head. He pointed back toward his own sprawling property, where a massive, tarp-covered mound sat near his front porch. "You should be cutting wood, old man. I had 5 full cords of seasoned oak and pine trucked up here last week. Cost me a fortune, but it's guaranteed to last us until April. You've barely got a fraction of that in your woodshed. You're going to freeze to death playing with mud." Arthur looked at David's massive pile of wood, then at the towering, uninsulated vaulted ceilings of David's A-frame cabin, and finally at the expensive metal stovepipe jutting from its roof. "Metal stoves are hungry beasts." "David," Arthur said softly, "they heat the air. Air doesn't hold heat. As soon as the fire dies, the cold comes back. And an open fireplace that'll suck the warmth right out of the room and send 80% of your heat straight up the chimney." David scoffed, visibly insulted by the unsolicited advice. It's a top-tier Norwegian design, Arthur. I think the engineers know what they're doing. Good luck with your dirt." With a dismissive wave, David turned and trekked back to his fortress of modern luxury. Arthur didn't argue. He just went back to stomping the mud. Inside his small, heavily insulated cabin, Arthur was constructing a masonry heater, specifically a heavily modified rocket mass heater. It was an ancient concept modernized for maximum efficiency. Instead of a large, open metal box, Arthur built a small, J-shaped combustion chamber out of high-heat fire bricks. Above the chamber, he installed a heat riser, a heavily insulated vertical pipe that forced the fire to burn at incredibly high temperatures, upwards of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This intense heat burned away all the smoke and creosote, creating a clean, roaring burn. But the real magic was in the exhaust. Instead of sending all that precious, hot gas straight up a chimney to heat the outside world, Arthur routed the exhaust pipe horizontally. He laid thick steel, ducting back and forth across the floor of his cabin, encasing the entire labyrinth of pipes in tons of the thick, heavy clay mixture he was stomping outside. He sculpted it into a massive, beautiful, wraparound bench that spanned half the cabin. By late October, the stove was finished. It didn't look like a stove at all. It looked like a beautiful, earthen sculpture seamlessly built into the architecture of the room. It took Arthur 3 weeks of small, gentle fires to cure the clay, slowly driving the moisture out until the earthen mass was rock solid. Meanwhile, next door, David, Clara, and Tom were treating their wilderness adventure like an extended ski resort vacation. They threw massive logs into their Norwegian cast-iron fireplace, enjoying the roaring flames, leaving the cabin doors open when it got too hot, completely oblivious to the monstrous weather system gathering just over the northern ridge. They thought they were invincible. They thought their mountain of wood was an infinite resource. They were completely unaware that the mountain was about to test them, and that their expensive preparations were nothing but a fatal illusion. The indigenous people of the region called it the White Breath, a meteorological anomaly where a high-pressure system parks itself over the mountains, dragging Arctic air straight down from the polar vortex. Modern meteorologists simply called it a deadly stationary blizzard. It hit on the 14th of November. The day started deceptively calm, the sky a bruised purple. By noon, the wind began to howl, a low, guttural roar that violently shook the heavy timber of the cabins. By 4 p.m., the temperature had plummeted an astonishing 50 degrees, settling at a bone-snapping 45 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The snow wasn't falling. It was being driven horizontally at 60 miles per hour, creating an impenetrable whiteout. Inside David's massive A-frame cabin, the nightmare began immediately. The stunning, floor-to-ceiling windows, while double-paned, were giant sheets of glass that bled heat into the frozen outdoors. Worse, the magnificent vaulted ceilings trapped whatever warm air the cast-iron fireplace produced, 20 feet above their heads. Down on the floor, where David, Clara, and Tom huddled, the air was freezing. "Turn it up! Put more wood on!" Clara yelled over the deafening roar of the wind battering the glass. She was wearing 2 winter coats, and her teeth were audibly chattering. Tom, wearing thick gloves, hauled 3 massive, heavy oak logs into the house, tracking in mounds of snow, and shoved them into the raging belly of the metal stove. He left the damper wide open. The fire roared, eating the oxygen, creating a massive draft. The iron glowed a dull cherry red. For a brief moment, A wave of radiant heat pushed back the cold. But it was a losing battle. The massive volume of air inside the cabin was too much for the stove to maintain. Every time they opened the stove door to add wood, the draft sucked the ambient heat from the room and violently ejected it up the chimney. They were literally trying to heat the freezing sky. To keep the temperature on the ground floor barely above freezing, they had to keep the stove completely stuffed with wood, burning at maximum capacity. By the end of the first 24 hours, the reality of their situation began to set in. David stood on the covered porch, staring in absolute horror at the woodpile. The tarp was violently flapping in the gale. The massive stack of 5 cords, which was supposed to last them 6 months, had a massive crater in it. They had burned through nearly half a cord in a single day and night, just to stave off hypothermia. "We need to slow it down," David told the others, panic finally edging into his usually confident voice. "We're burning too much. If we slow it down, we freeze." Tom shot back, his face pale. "The water pipes in the kitchen have already burst. The toilet is frozen solid. David, it's negative 45 degrees out there." Desperate, they tried to ration the wood on the second day. They damped down the stove. Within 2 hours, the temperature inside the cabin dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost began to form on the inside of the beautiful glass windows. Clara began to show early signs of hypothermia, her shivering turning violent and uncontrollable. Her lips tinged blue, terrified. David abandoned the rationing. He ordered Tom to bring in more wood. They built the fire back up into a raging, wood-devouring inferno. On the third day, the twist of their terrifying situation arrived. It wasn't just that they were burning wood too fast. It was the realization of their absolute helplessness. The storm showed no signs of breaking. The snow was now 4 feet deep against the doors. "I'll go cut more," Tom declared, grabbing David's brand-new, expensive-style chainsaw and heading out the back door into the blinding whiteout. He was back 10 minutes later, nearly in tears. The cold was so absolute that the lubricating oil in the chainsaw had frozen into a thick jelly. The engine wouldn't even turn over, even if it had. Stepping off the porch meant plunging into waist-deep, powdery snow, making it physically impossible to hike to the tree line. Fell a tree, bucket, and haul the heavy, unseasoned wet wood back. They were trapped, and the woodpile was almost gone. By midnight on the third day, the unthinkable happened. David carried the last 3 logs into the cabin. He placed them gently into the dying embers of the cast-iron stove. The massive mountain of wood that had given him so much arrogance weeks earlier had been entirely consumed, converted into smoke that had vanished into the Arctic wind. The 3 of them huddled together on the floor directly in front of the iron stove, wrapped in every sleeping bag and blanket they owned, watching the last logs catch fire. Silence fell over the cabin, save for the howling wind outside. They were watching a ticking clock. When that fire died, the freezing air would claim the cabin. Within 12 hours, they would freeze to death, a quarter of a mile away. Arthur Gallagher woke up in the dark. He stretched, tossing aside a light wool blanket. The ambient temperature in his small cabin was a perfectly comfortable 72 degrees. He padded across the floor in his socks. Arthur's survival didn't rely on brute force. It relied on efficiency. He walked over to the massive clay bench that spanned his wall. He placed his hand flat against the earthen mud. It was radiating a deep, penetrating, comforting heat, like a giant, warm stone sitting in the sun. He opened the small, 6-inch hatch of his rocket mass heater. Inside, The fire had gone out 10 hours ago, but the thousands of pounds of cob and clay that encased the exhaust pipes had absorbed every single ounce of heat from that fire. Instead of letting the heat escape up a chimney, the thermal mass trapped it, slowly releasing it into the cabin over a span of 24 hours. Arthur didn't need massive, heavy oak logs. He walked over to a small basket sitting next to the stove. Inside were nothing but pine cones, dried twigs, and scrap pieces of broken pallet wood, the kind of fuel David had laughed at. Arthur dropped a handful of twigs into the combustion chamber, struck a single wooden match, and dropped it in. Within seconds, the powerful draft of the J-tube sucked the flame inward. A fierce, low roar echoed from the stove, the sound of the rocket draft engaging. He fed 2 small pieces of split pine, no thicker than his wrist, into the chamber. That was it. That was his entire fuel consumption for the morning. Those 2 small sticks would burn at 2,000 degrees for an hour, charging the massive clay battery with enough heat to keep him perfectly warm until tomorrow. Arthur walked over to his window, wiped away a small patch of condensation, and peered out into the raging whiteout. Through the swirling darkness, he looked toward where David's cabin stood. Usually, there was a massive plume of thick black smoke pouring from David's chimney, a sign of their inefficient, desperate burning. Tonight, there was nothing. No smoke, no lights, just the terrifying, black void of the blizzard. Arthur's stomach tightened. He knew exactly what that missing smoke meant. The mountain had called David's bluff, and now lives were on the line. Arthur Gallagher did not hesitate. He understood the brutal mathematics of the Caribou Mountains. At 45 below zero, a human body devoid of an external heat source will cross the threshold of irreversible hypothermia in a matter of hours. The silence from the neighboring chimney wasn't just a sign of an extinguished fire. It was the chilling sound of a ticking clock reaching its final seconds. Arthur dressed with the meticulous, practiced efficiency of a man who knew that a single exposed patch of skin could mean severe frostbite. He layered thick merino wool beneath a heavy, waxed canvas anorak lined with beaver fur. He pulled on oversized Arctic mittens and strapped a pair of traditional ashwood and rawhide snowshoes to his insulated boots. Finally, he grabbed a heavy plastic utility toboggan and a coil of high-visibility nylon rope. Stepping out of his door was like stepping out of a spacecraft into a hostile alien atmosphere. The cold was a physical, blunt force object that punched the breath from his lungs. The wind howled with a deafening, demonic shriek, driving ice crystals into his exposed cheeks like thousands of tiny needles. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The world was a chaotic, churning void of violent white. Arthur navigated by memory and by the faint, dark silhouettes of the towering spruce trees that lined the property boundary. The quarter-mile trek, which usually took him 10 minutes on a pleasant summer afternoon, turned into an agonizing, hour-long battle against waist-deep snowdrifts and hurricane-force gusts that repeatedly threatened to knock him off his feet. When the massive A-frame cabin finally materialized out of the whiteout, it looked less like a luxury retreat and more like a frozen tomb. The beautiful, expensive, double-paned windows were completely opaque, coated on the inside with a thick layer of white frost. Arthur unclipped his snowshoes, waded onto the front porch, and pounded a heavy, fur-clad fist against the solid oak door. No answer. He gripped the wrought-iron handle, finding it slick with ice, and shoved hard. The door groaned, the hinges protesting against the frozen condensation before cracking open. The air inside the cabin was indistinguishable from the air outside. It was a suffocating, stagnant, bone-chilling freezer. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whistling of the wind tearing at the roof. In the center of the massive, cavernous living room stood the Norwegian cast-iron fireplace. It was dead, cold to the touch, surrounded by a sad scattering of bark and ash, and huddled on the floor directly in front of it, wrapped in a chaotic pile of sleeping bags, blankets, and expensive winter coats, was a single, unmoving mound. Arthur rushed forward and tore away the top layer of sleeping bags. David, Clara, and Tom were clustered together in a desperate embrace. They were in the second, highly dangerous stage of severe hypothermia. Their shivering had completely stopped, a terrifying clinical sign that their bodies had exhausted all energy reserves and were shutting down muscle function to protect the heart and brain. Clara's lips were a bruised, terrifying shade of violet. Tom's eyes were open, but his gaze was vacant, glassy, and unfocused. David was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently, his skin waxy and pale. "David, Clara, look at me," Arthur bellowed, his deep voice shattering the deathly quiet of the room. He didn't have time for gentleness. He grabbed David by the collar of his Arc'teryx jacket and hauled him to a sitting position. David blinked slowly, his head lolling. "Arthur, fire. The wood's gone," he slurred, his tongue thick and uncooperative. "I know it's gone. You're leaving. Now, get up," Arthur commanded. He knew he had minutes to act. He pulled 3 emergency Mylar space blankets from his pack and wrapped them tightly around their torsos beneath their coats, trapping whatever residual body heat remained. He forced Tom onto his feet, then hauled David up, draping the younger man's arm over his broad shoulder. Clara was too weak to stand. Her legs simply buckled beneath her. Without a word, Arthur scooped Clara up and carried her out to the porch, gently laying her inside the plastic utility toboggan. He strapped her in securely with the nylon rope. "Listen to me," Arthur shouted over the roaring wind, grabbing both David and Tom by the shoulders and giving them a hard shake. "You step in my tracks. You do not stop moving. If you sit down in this snow, you will never stand back up. Do you understand me?" Tom nodded numbly. David just stared blankly into the whiteout. The journey back to Arthur's cabin was a nightmare of endurance. Arthur broke trail, his massive snowshoes compacting the powder, hauling the heavy toboggan containing Clara by a strap across his chest. Behind him, David and Tom stumbled like drunkards, their frozen muscles barely responding to their brains' commands. Twice, Tom fell face first into the drifts, and twice, Arthur had to drop the tow rope, wade back, and physically drag the man back to his feet, screaming at him to keep moving. By the time they reached Arthur's porch, Arthur's own lungs were burning, and his vision was blurring at the edges. He kicked off his snowshoes, shoved the cabin door open, and dragged the toboggan directly inside, shouting for the 2 men to follow. Once they were over the threshold, Arthur slammed the heavy door shut, throwing the iron deadbolt, cutting off the shriek of the blizzard. The contrast was immediate and violently shocking. David and Tom collapsed onto the wide plank wooden floor, gasping for air. As their frozen brains slowly began to process their surroundings, a wave of profound confusion washed over them. The air in the cabin was incredibly, perfectly warm. It wasn't the harsh, dry, scorching heat of an open fire. It was a soft, enveloping warmth that felt like a thick summer blanket. David, his teeth beginning to chatter violently as his body reawakened to the temperature change, looked around the small space in absolute bewilderment. He looked for the roaring fire, the massive iron box, the glowing embers. He looked for the source of their salvation. There was nothing. The cabin was quiet. There was no crackling wood, no roaring draught. There was just a small, clean room, and a massive, elegantly sculpted earthen bench winding its way across the far wall. "Where?" David stammered, pulling himself up onto his elbows. "Where is the fire? How is it so warm?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. He was busy unstrapping Clara from the sled. He lifted her freezing body and carried her over to the massive clay bench. "Don't put her on the dirt, Arthur. She needs a fire," Tom croaked, his voice raw. "Just watch," Arthur said quietly, laying Clara directly onto the smooth, curved surface of the earthen mass. The moment Clara's shivering body made contact with the earthen bench, a sharp gasp escaped her bruised lips. The clay structure was not merely warm, it pulsed with a deep, penetrating thermal energy. Unlike the harsh, dry, convection heat produced by David's expensive Norwegian metal stove, which simply heated the air that immediately rushed up to the vaulted ceilings, this was long-wave infrared radiation. The dense mass of the mud battery functioned like a giant, sun-baked boulder. The heat didn't just wrap around Clara, it sank deep into her freezing muscle tissue, aggressively warming her blood and thawing her from the inside out. Arthur guided a stumbling David and Tom to sit beside her. As the two men collapsed onto the sculpted mud, their eyes widened in absolute shock. The sheer, overwhelming comfort was paralyzing. Within 15 minutes, their violent shivering completely ceased. The deathly violet hue began to fade from Clara's cheeks, replaced by the faint, rosy flush of returning circulation. "I don't understand," David whispered, his voice hoarse. He ran a trembling hand over the smooth, hardened clay beneath him. It was uniformly hot from end to end, a massive radiator spanning the room. He looked around the cabin, his eyes frantically searching for a massive cast-iron box, a glowing bed of coals, or a mountain of chopped oak. "Where is the fire?" "Arthur, there's no smoke, there's no roaring flame. How is this physically possible?" Arthur pulled up a simple wooden stool. He didn't gloat. The brutal reality of the mountain had already done the lecturing. "You relied on brute force, David," Arthur explained quietly, pouring 3 mugs of warm water from a kettle resting on a steel plate. "Your metal stove is built to heat air, but air holds almost zero thermal mass. It's a terrible battery. The second your fire goes out, the ambient cold steals the heat right back through your glass. You were running on a treadmill, burning half a forest just to stay at zero." Arthur leaned down and opened a tiny, 6-inch metal hatch near the floor. He gestured for David to look inside. David leaned forward, expecting to see a cavernous firebox. Instead, he saw a narrow, J-shaped tunnel of fire brick. It was completely empty, save for a dusting of white ash. "It's a rocket mass heater," Arthur continued. "I don't heat the air. I heat the earth. When I light a fire in that chamber, the insulated heat riser creates a violent draft. It pulls oxygen in so rapidly that the wood burns at nearly 2,000 degrees. It incinerates everything, even the smoke. But the real secret is the exhaust. Instead of sending all those superheated gases straight out a chimney to warm up the blizzard, the exhaust pipe runs horizontally. It zigzags back and forth, right underneath you." Tom stared down between his boots, awe dawning on his pale face. "The cob and sand absorb all that heat like a sponge," Arthur said, patting the bench. By the time the exhaust finally exits my cabin, it's only 80 degrees. I capture 95% of the thermal energy. An hour of burning charges this mud battery, and it radiates heat for 24 hours. David swallowed hard, the memory of his 5 cords of premium, wasted oak flashing in his mind. How much wood do you use? Arthur reached into a small woven basket, pulled out 3 dry pine cones and 2 splintered pieces of a broken shipping pallet, and tossed them onto the table. About that much, once a day. For the next 4 days, the white breath blizzard battered the Caribou Mountains with hurricane-force winds and 50 below temperatures. Inside, the 4 of them survived in perfect 72-degree comfort, powered by nothing more than twigs and pine cones. When the storm finally broke on the 7th morning, the sun revealed a dazzling, frozen wasteland. The group strapped on snowshoes and trekked the quarter-mile back to David's property. The A-frame was a monument to shattered hubris. Without a constant, raging fire, the modern luxury cabin had been swiftly conquered by the deep freeze. The massive double-pane windows, stressed by the violent temperature shifts, had spiderwebbed with massive, jagged cracks. Every water pipe in the walls had burst, flooding the hardwood floors with a layer of solid, impenetrable ice. The Norwegian cast-iron stove sat in the middle of the ruined room, a freezing, useless iron tombstone. Tom and Clara immediately began discussing a snowmobile evacuation back to Seattle. They were done with the wild. But David stood on his frozen porch, staring at the empty expanse where his massive, expensive woodpile had once been. He turned and walked back to Arthur. The tech executive arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, hard-earned humility. "Insurance will fix the pipes and the glass," David said quietly, his breath pluming in the crisp air. "But I'm ripping that iron fireplace out today." Arthur adjusted his canvas coat. "Going to buy a more expensive one?" David smiled a faint, genuine smile. "No. I was hoping, when the ground finally thaws, you might teach me how to stomp some mud. Nature doesn't care about your budget, but it will always respect ingenuity." If Arthur's brilliant mud stove survival story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Right now, share this video with anyone who loves off-grid living, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible, true-to-life survival dramas. What would you do in David's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.